So we'll start the panel right on time. My name is Max Schanzenbach. I guess I'm moderating the panel. Because these are somewhat disparate topics, we decided that we would do presentation followed by question session. So instead of doing questions at the end, we'll do them right after the speaker. And so our first speaker is BYRON STIER from Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles to speak on viewpoint diversity and law school faculty hiring. And he will be followed by ANNEMARIE-SLOBIG and Grace MANNIX-SLOBIG, who will speak on truth, power, and responsibility in the training of mental health practitioners. And at the end, YURACKO, my colleague from Northwestern, and I will present on deregulating student speech in higher education, advocating for a First Amendment standard in student speech. So take it away, BYRON.
So how are you all doing? You survived lunch, you're back here, you're food coma, doing okay? All right, I got to take the feel of the classroom before I get fully into this. So I'm going to be discussing viewpoint diversity in law school faculty hiring, and I'm going to just make several points. Of course, I'll probably consume my full 20 minutes doing so. But the first one is just about the importance of thinking about viewpoint diversity. Probably a point I don't need to make at this conference, but maybe I do actually though, because those of us who attended the president's panel, I thought it would actually maybe start with a rebuttal of President Roth's remarks from Wesleyan, comparing, focusing on viewpoint diversity now, as I think his remark was, being concerned with the sociology department at the University of Kiev when Putin is invading Ukraine. The thing is, without analogy, and it was very powerful, emotional, those of us who were in the room on that, to think about it, you say, of course that's an irrelevant thing to think about. But the thing is, President Putin is not invading Ukraine because of the sociology department at the University of Kiev. Like, that's not what he's saying. But President Trump is saying that viewpoint diversity and anti-Semitism are reasons for the incursions, in a way, against universities. I think it is an important topic for us to be concerned about. And universities have created this vulnerability with regard to viewpoint diversity even before President Trump. So that's my first point. My second point is to argue that universities' historic and ongoing efforts to support diversity in other measures of identity, we think about gender, race, sexual orientation, should also entail a similar consideration of tolerance and even support for viewpoint diversity. And I'm going to make a somewhat odd comment in that regard when I talk a little bit more about it. Argue that even among critical legal studies faculty, given their concern and focus on group dynamics and oppression, I know this is not probably going to be a winning argument with them, but I'll just throw it out, that they actually should be concerned about this too, about the effects of group dynamics, oppression, majority influence, even when it's against conservatives and libertarians. The third point I want to make is to just sort of raise some strategies for supporting viewpoint diversity in law school faculties and also in students, and how to combat bias in the hiring process. At base, a lot of progress would be made if law schools simply thought about viewpoint diversity in similar ways that they thought about other kinds of diversity regarding race, gender, sexual orientation, in things like trainings, programming, speakers, surveys of students, etc. In particular, with regard to how to advance viewpoint diversity in faculty hiring, I think objective guidelines are really helpful to guide faculty hiring committees as to what they're looking for. And somewhat oddly, again, I'm going to suggest that maybe we should start thinking in academia, taking a page from the law context. I teach legal ethics. The notion of a conflict of interest. I think this needs to be restated, that the responsibility of a teacher is not exactly coterminous with one's personal political responsibilities. We have a responsibility to meet the needs of the institution as scholars, as service persons, as teachers. And so maybe for us to think a little bit about if people's politics in the classroom go too far, it can be kind of a personal conflict of interest. They're putting their own views ahead of the institutional needs. So that's a little out there too, but I'll get to that. So all right, let me step back and think, talk a bit more about the larger picture. Law schools are are obviously rife with policy disagreements. I love being at this conference because I'm hearing from all these empiricists, and it's wonderful to get actual information, debates about data. In law schools, we don't do enough of that. But we do a lot of arguing about policy and what should happen. It's almost self-evident that the law involves diversity of views, okay? If it didn't, what on earth are we doing in these Supreme Court justices' hearings where everyone goes at it? Their viewpoints have a huge effect on the shape of the law. If we go to some of the Supreme Court opinions about diversity, in the 1978, in the seminal Bakke decision on diversity in admissions, and you look through the language and you're thinking about what's their real goal, the opinion from Justice Powell, which becomes most influential from that whole decision, includes the line, few students and no one who has practiced law would choose to study in an academic vacuum, removed from the, quote, this is all a quote, but interplay of ideas and the exchange of views with which the law is concerned. The overarching viewpoint diversity is the larger point under which racial diversity fits. That's the one that wins, is that racial diversity gets to the viewpoint diversity, but the overarching view is viewpoint diversity. That's what is being pushed in Bakke, in Powell's opinion. In 2003, in Grutter, the court, again with this language, these benefits are not theoretical but real, as major American businesses have made clear that the skills needed in today's increasingly global marketplace can only be developed through exposure to widely diverse people, cultures, ideas, and viewpoints. It's in Grutter in the Supreme Court opinion in 2003. Even hopping forward to 2023, the Harvard decision, which I know continues to make waves across the country, Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, has the following line. It may be the case that exposure to different perspectives and thoughts can foster debate, sharpen young minds, and hone students' reasoning skills. Later, he also positively references ideological diversity. Are you getting a trend here of the importance of viewpoint diversity in the eyes of the Supreme Court at universities? In 2024, the ABA adopted Standard 208 on academic freedom and freedom of expression. And in one of their interpretations of that standard, the ABA opined, quote again, effective legal education and the development of the law require the free, robust, and uninhibited sharing of ideas reflecting a wide range of viewpoints. Becoming an effective advocate or counselor requires learning how to conduct candid and civil discourse in respectful disagreement with others while advancing reasoned and evidence-based arguments. I mean, could that be out of the brochure from this conference, okay, and Heterodox Academy? So it's very important and very clearly stated in these various sources from the Supreme Court and the ABA. But if you turn from the goals to the reality in law schools, it's quite different with regard to viewpoint diversity. Again, point probably not controversial in this room, but nevertheless, let me trot out some of the data in law schools. While studies vary, they suggest perhaps in law faculties, something like 10 to 15% of the professors would be classified as conservative or libertarian. That data tends to predate like 2015. So it predates the larger shift towards the social advocacy university. So if anything, probably that data overestimates now the amount of conservative and libertarian professors. So 10 to 15% of law faculties, conservative and libertarian, 38% of the general 35% of lawyers, meanwhile, conservative libertarian, so a big gap there, and 38% of the general population identifying as conservative. There's a never-ending debate about the number of libertarians out there. Those who are libertarian inclined, it's like a point for humor, but libertarians tend to overestimate their own prevalence. And so Cato says we're 10 to 20% is libertarian. Maybe some of that overlaps with the 38% conservative, maybe not, but probably more than 38% would be conservative and libertarian versus 10 to 15% on law faculties. All right, so I want to say a few words about critical legal studies because I think the dynamics apply here. They should apply here. I think critical studies faculty should be worried about this stuff, this mismatch, given their views generally. So what are their views, the critical legal studies faculty? I mean, I'm not speaking for all of them, but I think there's some key points that critical faculty are making. They're worried about the tendency of hierarchies to reproduce themselves. They're worried about the tendency of persons to increase their own power by combining with others they perceive to be similar to them. They broadly think that there's a worry that people are pursuing their own power in general. Could these things fit in our concern about the effect of hiring in faculties and the fact we have a big underrepresentation of conservatives and libertarians? I'll leave it to you to think about that. And the concern for critical faculty is when those dynamics are raised in the context of race, gender, sexual orientation, why are those concerns dropped when we get to viewpoint diversity? I mean, don't they still apply? So let's look at a couple areas of focus where there's perhaps a double standard, differential standards. One is differential representation, where a lot of times we're looking at the percent of faculty versus the percent in the country. For women, the percent of faculty in law schools, the recent data I found was 49% female law professors versus 51% male, 2% gap in that. Other data from the ALS, Association of American Law Schools in 2024, said that a majority of law faculty who are in tenure since 2010 were women, which is great, okay? But I'm just saying, if we think about that in the differential, with regard to race, the percent of the black population is 14%. The percent of black law professors is 7 to 13% based on some of the estimates out there, which is a gap of 1 to 7%. Obviously, you can look at not just the arithmetic gap, but how much below they're the percent. Like they're 71% of what they should be if they were matching the population, black law professors. Latino, the population is approximately 19%. The percent of law professors is 6 to 9%, so a bigger gap for Latino law professors. And so it's a gap of 14 or so, and that would say they're about 39% of what they should be if they were matching the population in law professors. But again, if you look back to libertarians and conservatives in law schools, the 10 to 15% on law faculties versus approximately 38% or more in the population, the gap is maybe 18 to 28%, and they're maybe a third of what you would expect if they were matching the population. So it's not to say that I'm not discounting, I'm embracing all of this. All of this is interesting and relevant and pertinent, but it's a little odd that the group that has the largest gap is the group that gets the least attention and the least effort in these discussions. A second question pertains to not just differential representation, but differential treatment on campuses. And so, conservative and libertarian professors, although President Roth was suggesting maybe there should be affirmative action for them, they've not been getting affirmative action. There's that difference in hiring that's pretty significant. And so it's not being measured or included in discussions in general as a positive thing. With regard to administrative infrastructures and other things that are differential treatment, of course, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent national protest, there was, as at all of our campuses, enormous attention to what the administrations could do to try and ameliorate the campus environment. As we know, trainings, other administrative structures, student meetings, support, and that's speaking for my own view, great. Okay, like I'm not arguing against any support for any group. The more support, the better. Okay, that would be my personal view on this. More support, the better. And those who supported it, when you look to the lack of that support for conservative or libertarian students, or just the question of political dialogue and political diversity on campuses, some would say, well, we had George Floyd. That was a major national movement. Granted, absolutely. But we also had January 6th. Didn't we have January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, which was also a similar reckoning about division in this country and concerns? But it didn't elicit a similar response from universities about political dialogue that I saw. An additional concern is that some of the diversity trainings that did happen, while they might have been successful, well-intentioned with regard to the diversity they were looking at, race, gender, sexual orientation, they might have excluded conservative or libertarian voices in those trainings who were maybe not welcomed in their comments or their perspectives, which could have an effect of dampening their views and their acceptance on campus as well. So I would say also, a very significant concern is the same attention to data. So if you're looking at surveys that track student inclusion and belonging, the concern is, if students that are conservative or libertarian are reporting that they're not feeling included, all of our statements say everyone should be included, but if students who are conservative libertarian are reporting they're not being included, and then that data is not, you do not bring the same attention to that data that you bring to other groups on campus, i.e. you ignore it and don't do anything, that's also a concern of differential treatment and a differential standard for who's included and who's not. I guess I want to yell out to the heavens, inclusion is supposed to be everybody, I thought. I thought it was supposed to be we're all included, thank you, on that. So if we're including only some, it starts to look like exclusion and preference, which is a worry. Okay, a couple of the counter arguments to raise, from, which I've heard from colleagues also in discussions on this. A main one is that conservatives and libertarians are not historically marginalized communities in this country. Granted, that I think is true. They have not suffered law-based de jure discrimination. But is the larger goal not to just undo the past, but also to create a present that involves no marginalization, that all people are welcome, all perspectives are welcome? If that's the case, then I think that's a response to that argument. Another argument is, counter-argument is, politics is changeable, and other categories of diversity are not. Race, gender, sexual orientation. Although perhaps some might have arguments, some in the community on sexual orientation think maybe there is some play that they actually think is empowering to have some choice, So, but I guess I would say in today's age, even though there is an ability to change one's views, do we really think that America is fluid in its politics? Or do we think people are pretty fixed right now? And that when students come into law school, their political identity is closely connected to their own stable sense of self? If that's the case, we should be concerned about it for inclusion. And some of them have political views that emanate from their religious beliefs, which also we don't normally think of that as easily changeable. Okay, so I've got a few minutes here to talk about some of the things to do about it. I did want to say also for public universities, obviously, does the country have right now a problem in political division? I mean, is that something that's controversial? One of the key goals of public universities is to serve the public good. It would seem that the viewpoint diversity is a signal contribution to the public good right now to further understanding across ideological lines. In terms of things to do about this, one question is, should you do affirmative action for conservatives and libertarians? President Roth just made that argument just briefly in the panel. I don't think that's a practical suggestion right now. Part of that is just my feeling interacting with lots of colleagues who are reeling from the Harvard decision. I mean, the idea that you're losing a tool to increase racial diversity on campuses, and then the coup de grace is they roll in with now affirmative action for conservatives, it's just a non-starter. It's not a practical suggestion, I think, right now with faculties. So if we're not going to do an affirmative action thing, what can we do? And again, as I've said, giving similar attention to viewpoint diversity as other kinds of diversities in trainings, in programmings, in surveys would be a huge benefit. Developing objective guidelines, thank you so much, for faculty in the hiring committee would be very useful. How they evaluate candidates, give them a list of things they're supposed to be looking for if we're trying to combat bias. Where could you get a list of that? Look at your tenure standards. They probably have, as we do, a list of criteria to evaluate scholarship and also teaching. And the teaching criteria, as ours do, may well include reference to creating an open atmosphere in the classroom with various viewpoints. That would be an important thing to evaluate a candidate. I've already made the point on conflicts of interest, but I still think it bears repeating. I think in recent years I've heard, I don't know if you've heard, some faculty who who think that their teaching, it morally has to be advancing their own political agenda. That's something I never heard before the last like 10 years. So I would never thought that needed to be said, that your role as a teacher is a professional role that is not exactly coterminous necessarily with your own personal political views. Their responsibility is a balanced treatment. But I think the idea of a personal conflict of interest in ethics codes or just ethics ideas would be useful to import. Let me, in closing, I'm down to my last 30 seconds or so on this, then we have time for Q&A, hopefully. Obviously, my overall summary is to give it the same attention as other kinds of diversity, think about objective guidelines, about conflicts of interest and that idea. But I wanted to, in closing, invoke this image of Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. This is what I get for not taking my allergy pill. Apologies. Justice Scalia, a well-known conservative, to put it mildly, at least among law schools, right? Justice Ginsburg, a well-known progressive liberal on the court, right? Both full-throated in their views, arguing through the years of history and their opinions against each other. But did you know they were also great friends? They appeared in an opera together, performing together. There's pictures of them riding an elephant together. They were great friends. I just want to suggest that the idea of Ginsburg and Scalia, maybe it's more of a law school thing, but it's a nice image for us to think about as we think about how we could kind of rebuild this broken system where people aren't engaging. Two people, as opposed as any two people could be, as fighting each other in opinions could be, still manage to be great friends. So I would kind of call for, wouldn't it be nice to have like a Scalia-Ginsburg project? Can you imagine mugs and T-shirts and people from different backgrounds, some of whom love Ginsburg? You could call it Scalia-Ginsburg for some people and Ginsburg-Scalia for others. You could have different T-shirts with different orders of the names. But something like that, where everyone can say, even our great icons, whether it's a conservative or progressive, they found a way to get together and have a friendship and have mutual understanding. And it would be not only a good thing for the country, but it really would be a tribute, kind of a parting gift to the greatest jurists of the United States Supreme Court history, who had given so much in their careers, and even in death could be giving more to the country. Anyway, thank you so much. I went over by a minute 26. Appreciate it. Sure, whatever you wish to think. If you have questions or not.
I actually have...
You just all persuaded, no questions. This is what...
You can go first.
Okay. So just think about with respect to law schools, is it important, why is the intellectual diversity important? Is it for research or is it for teaching or is it for both? And I think for some reason, to me, it's more compelling for teaching at the school level. Because with research, you could have people sort between schools based on ideological preferences, and some of that certainly goes on. And so you maybe don't impinge the research as much, but with teaching, I guess my question would be, is that where you view the importance, and is it, and could it be fixed by just instructing faculty to do what lawyers are supposed to do, which is argue both sides when the issue is raised?
I mean, and we've got a former dean on our panel, so I want to defer to your thoughts as well. You could answer and ask questions if you wish. But I mean, I think you won't be surprised the lawyer, given a fork in the road, takes both sides of it. But of course, it's crucial for teaching for students who may come to law school with one set of views, but may face a judge in practice with a different set of views. If they are not exposed to alternative arguments, their first experience, with opposing views where they're figuring out their response may be in this kind of situation in front of a court. You want to get them savvy about opposing arguments as early as possible. So surely on the teaching, but in the research as well. I mean, let's step back for a second. We're all governed by the law, okay? Every one of us in this room, the amount of laws circling us for safety, going on right now in this room that are governing the way we're interacting with each other, with the building, contractually, with a swirl of laws. I don't want to overstate what law professors do, but we do have an influence on the law. So if the law professors are massively not representative of the population who's governed by the law, we have worries. These are the kinds of concerns, effectively well-argued concerns in racial diversity, gender diversity. Justice Ginsburg those who've seen the movies, made her career by saying, you're not understanding women's perspectives, and racial perspectives, all these perspectives. So that's a tremendous concern as well. One last quick response to that. There's an example of this when the Obamacare, I know the names keep changing of it, was coming up for Supreme Court review, and there was a large consensus among law professors that the arguments against it were bogus. And it was kind of taken as a general view. But we know that it came very close. I think Justice Roberts switched his vote at the end, and it almost came out with an opinion that was completely at odds with the general consensus. And it's seen as an example of echo chamber within law faculties. They didn't really consider what's happening in reality. So one of the jobs of law is also to predict and understand in scholarship as well. That was also a disservice to the public that would have been very unready for what was about to happen. Sorry.
So I entirely agree about the importance of ideological diversity in law school. So now the question. Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. So for public universities, for public universities or for private universities to voluntarily commit to First Amendment principles, is it going to be constitutionally problematic for them to take political ideology into account when they're making hiring decisions? And if so, is there another way to sort of massage it so it's not political ideology, maybe it's methodology, or maybe it's endorsement of a particular school? Because I'm really sympathetic to the importance of ideological diversity, but I'm concerned that public universities and private universities that commit to the First Amendment are going to have problems.
And I think it's easier if one doesn't take the affirmative action view as I was suggesting, not to do, to try and do, which apart from it being impractical now, given the atmosphere in the wake of the Harvard decision, it may also have the problems you're saying. But if the goal is not really doing extra weight for them, but trying to make it even with objective guidelines and then support it once people are on campus, then hopefully that would avoid those concerns. But any other questions? Okay.
But I'm sure the panels will stick around afterwards.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm ANNEMARIE-SLOBIG. Thanks for coming. As Max said, I am at the Chicago School, which is a private university in Chicago. It's started as a freestanding professional school training clinical psychologists in the late 70s, early 80s. And over the last several decades has morphed into a university, still mostly doing psychology, but we'll be opening a College of Osteopathic Medicine in the fall in Chicago, and has campuses in 5 different locations across the country. The interest we have in this topic, I chair a clinical doctoral program training around 65 doctoral students in clinical psychology a year. This is a 5-year program leading to licensure for clinical psychologists. My interest, of course, as a psychologist first is in our ethical principle of not doing harm. That do no harm expectation is a really important imperative, and clinical training has such crucial implications for whether or not practitioners are going to do harm. And so we wanted to sort of take the conference theme of truth, power, and responsibility and bring it to the question of psychotherapy training in general in order to kind of get at some of the things that we're concerned about and sort of sound the alarm and maybe talk some about some issues.
Is it better if I use this? Okay. All right, great. Hi, my name is Grace MANNIX-SLOBIG, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I also supervise the Masters of Social Work trainees who are placed in the practice as part of their clinical training. And so I imagine you're probably already noticing the similarity in our last names, and if you're guessing we're related, you are correct. Annie is my niece.
You look so young. Switch that, reverse it.
Oh, yeah. So Annie and I approach this with 2 different perspectives, but we really share a growing sense of concern and want to sound the alarm and offer some recommendations for better practices. And I'll be speaking to my firsthand experience with a more recent mental health training and my own motives to self-censor, as well as just some of my insights and what we believe would be an improvement.
All right, so we chose this topic. You know, I've been training clinical psychologists for over 25 years. Grace did her MSW at NYU during the pandemic, mostly on Zoom. We've, you know, as she said, have had different experiences, but we really have been concerned about what we see as kind of really frightening levels of certainty on display in the profession among our student population and then among licensed clinicians out there, as evidenced in some social media. When I get the first point I kind of want to make is that I think that some of what has happened in the effort to train people, to prepare people to work with diverse populations, it was a good idea to do that. Psychologists it used to not be part of the accreditation standards that you had to sort of train practitioners to be ready to work with people who are different from them, which is, when you think about it, stepping back several decades, that seems a little absurd. And I went to a program in the, late 80s, early 90s, where it prided itself on being kind of on the vanguard of embracing a kind of diversity training that was provocative and challenging and inviting students into thinking about bias that they might hold by virtue of their own social and cultural location and trying to understand how social forces had an impact on people's mental health, et cetera, how to really manage their feelings about working across various kinds of difference and know about those things in complex ways. That was the aspiration. I mean, people who do this really well, do what is called in the literature cultural humility. They balance understanding difference with meeting individuals with empathy and true desire to understand them. And so I think what has happened has been kind of an overcorrection where there was this desire to really lean into these issues in a way that then found frightening levels of what Alana Redstone, in this really great book that she came out with last year, she presented here last year, The Certainty Trap. She describes in The Certainty Trap kind of pretty concerning levels of errors in thinking that lead to some problems. I mean, that combined with problems on our campuses with free expression, don't need to tell anybody at HXA about problems with campus expression, has made it really difficult for us to have actually more nuanced conversations about difference. So you're going to talk a little bit about the two topics we're going to talk about.
Exactly. So we really find that this certainty means that no questions can, people begin to act as if no questions can be asked. And there's two examples from her book that we want to specifically draw on. So the first is called the settled question fallacy. And that happens when you feel your knowledge about a given topic is correct and complete. And when we do that, when we think we have a corner on the truth, it's really easy to judge those who don't share those views. It really requires work to challenge ourselves to recognize this pull to treat certain questions as settled, especially when they evoke certain feelings within us. And so we want to reinforce that all knowledge can be challenged, and it's very important to leave a little bit of room for uncertainty. The second one is called the fallacy of known intent. This happens when you assume someone else's motive. And so when we are engaging with someone and we believe that they have some sort of malicious intent, it becomes very easy to dismiss their point of view.
So kind of going back to students in training, where our concern is that this kind of certainty, at best leads to lapses in treatment, ruptures in relationships, but at worst can really land in some outright abuses. And of course, in going back to do no harm, we don't want there to be harm. And so we think it would be important to sort of call out some of the examples where this sort of distorting of the role of the therapist can happen in response to some of these kind of errors in the way we've done this training.
Yep, so we've got a couple of different examples here that we want to show how it, again, distorts the role of the therapist. It heightens division. It excludes therapists from opportunities to consider alternative viewpoints. And it also would reduce access to treatment for some patients. after that, we want to share some ideas of what we might do about this.
Yeah, and some of you who were at the panel yesterday in the afternoon about the mental health and medical training and issues of politicization there, I thought for sure Sally Sattel, who wrote this article in the Free Press, might mention this issue, but she didn't. But we saw one issue that I think is an example of sort of how the settled question fallacy might lead clinicians to do things that actually do harm. And it's that in Chicago last March, there was a group of therapists that got listed as Zionist therapists that essentially was a blacklist, that many of the members of that blacklist were there, we presume, presumably just because of their Jewish identity. They weren't necessarily explicitly Zionist, but which is beside the point. I'm just saying that, that this was a very concerning thing. Grace, talk a little bit about the details.
Exactly. So we want to remind you, some of the issues we're going to talk about here are complex and contentious issues. And what we really feel is that it's the certainty exhibited in the behaviors that we object to. It's a certainty that we're really finding problematic. So here you can see on a message board, there's a link to a blacklist document. It says, you know, I've put together a list of therapists and practices that we should avoid referring clients or patients to. And then there's an attempt here to sort of moderate it and distinguish between Zionists and Jews that, you know, A, misses the point and doesn't address the problem of the list in the first place. Fortunately, in this case, the clinician who posted this was reprimanded by the licensing board and required to perform some continuing education. But unfortunately, that was little more than a slap on the wrist for an egregious ethical violation, and it also didn't result in fruitful dialogue. Some of the therapists who were on this blacklist also expressed some skepticism about any contrition or remorse by those who constructed or distributed this list.
Yeah, you can see sort of where that attitude is on full display here in this post from an organization called Inclusive Therapists. The screenshot on the left, you know, licensing boards are not our friends. They deny genocide. They uphold white supremacy, cis heteronormativity, and ableism. They exist to govern, not protect. This framework or thinking about what licensing boards do, again, something worth discussing and knowing about and arguing, but it reveals such a specifically, you know, sort of uniform view of what, I guess I'm sort of imagining that the therapists who contributed to that list being told engage in continuing ed, if this is their attitude about what their licensing board is all about, it probably didn't do a whole lot of good. I don't know who was going to also determine what was the appropriate continuing ed, so that is also a complex thing. This organization is a community and a resource hub for people. Part of their mission statement I've reproduced here. We are boldly anti-genocide, anti-colonial, anti-occupation, anti-oppression. It goes on. The link for where you can see that it's highlighted anti-genocide is a live link, and that link is a bunch of resources and social media assets, you know, screenshots of things that are a very sort of unnuanced, very specific, settled question version of the Israel-Hamas war, and again, sort of putting out there for that group of therapists and anybody who comes upon it and people who are treated by therapists in that list, that there's sort of just one way to think about this particular issue. And so, you know, they're saying they're committed to justice and inclusion, and I suspect there are many people who would feel quite excluded by this attitude, and we think this is kind of a common problem.
Okay, so what you're looking at here is a screenshot from a Zoom chat in a class of mine. After the horrific death of George Floyd in May of 2020, my statistics and research professor made an attempt to address the class about the BLM movement. And he asked us to consider why some might hold the perspective or the idea that, quote, all lives matter. And I can't remember the specific comment that he made, but I remember at the time it felt like a mild request to consider an
alternate viewpoint. But I can remember the response from the class and how that felt. Our professor was just immediately met with contempt from the class, and the entire class session became derailed to instead educate our professor on his offense and make no offer for constructive repair. The atmosphere was very hostile, and students were openly criticizing him, and this Zoom chat became like this nonstop live stream of either judgment or praise, depending on who spoke up. And as you can see in the transcript there, one student wrote, "All white students who have not said a single thing in this class, in the chat or in the conversation, would love to hear your perspective. Silence is enabling." And while likely intended to prompt some engagement, this comment was very revealing of the coercive dynamic that had taken hold. Silence was no longer seen as reflective or hesitation. It was instead interpreted as a moral failure. And I want to remind you, this is in the context of a graduate course for future mental health practitioners. So when we're kind of in that educational setting, right, that's discouraging nuance, that's very suspicious of hesitation, it not only undermines open inquiry, but it also risks producing practitioners who struggle to sit with discomfort or uncertainty or perspectives that are different from their own. And after this class session, our professor was immediately removed for the rest of the semester, which further confirmed that constructive dialogue was just unattainable. And I was really horrified because, us social workers, we pride ourselves on our openness and our unwavering effort for cooperation. And what really could have been an opportunity for a rich dialogue was instead an exercise in dogpiling. And it was crystal clear to me at that point that my classmates had fallen into the certainty trap.
We wanted to talk a little bit about sort of instances of exclusion, and this is an example. This post is, someone posted on a different mental health group in Chicago, an article about the dangers of decolonial therapy. I think asking for conversation about this, and then posted here on a Jewish Therapist Collective group that she had been removed from that group simply for posting the article. She had actually posted it anonymously and still got removed. I included this post on the right, which was a response from a person who is the director of a local college counseling center, and so involved in the clinical training of mental health professionals, and said, maybe you should get some non-Zio peers. I mean, again, it's essentially using Zio as a slur, and it's pretty excluding. I mean, saying, we're going to kick you off this board because we don't like the way you think. The question of whether or not it's okay to exclude clients or not take care of clients who disagree with you politically is something that, when Trump was elected the first time, my faculty, I think, was really ready to meet our students who came in distressed the next day and said, how am I going to go out to the suburbs and see my patients who I'm pretty sure voted for Trump? It's very upsetting. And we've really thought very clearly, we know what to do. We're going to help them manage themselves, put their own feelings away, take care of their clients. And 8 years later, when Trump was elected again, I mean, the number of licensed therapists out there who wrote on these message boards, and if you heard a little bit about this from Dean McKay yesterday in that panel, these are kind of cesspools. I understand. I thank you to my brother-in-law, Michael, who shares these things with me. I can't be in these places. It would be dangerous for me to. But there's so much vitriol about Trump and so much seeming comfort in just saying things like, I don't think I can hold space for my clients who voted to take away my rights and things like that. Here's an article in Psychology Today sort of entertaining this question about whether or not it's okay, and clearly sort of saying this is ethically we should be training people to put their stuff away.
Yeah, and then in this one, a poster is trying to intervene on a message board that's, again, blowing up with a tremendous amount of certainty, with it not being okay to hold space for a client who potentially voted for Trump. And you can notice that these negative reactions as the top comments here, you know, no one asked you in your audacity, or just, I'm so sick of hearing this shit. So you can understand the attitude here. And this is what happened when there was just a very reasonable invitation for some self-reflection. And that's especially if a therapist is experiencing a reaction to their client that might interfere with their capacity to meet them with unconditional positive regard.
I think I'm going to just kind of skip the next example because we're going to be short on time, but it was really about an anti-oppressive practice, sort of training you not to manage this complex, nuanced question with people, but to school your patient on how they don't understand things, and we can talk about that. But the big concern we have there is this sort of collapsing all of the nuance about difference into binary categories, that you're either oppressed or you're the oppressor. And that framework becomes really problematic in understanding difference and actually engaging in relationships across difference.
Okay, and in my own grad school education, it was made really explicit. You know, intent doesn't matter, only impact does. If your intent doesn't matter, how can you be genuinely curious about any additional viewpoints? Or why would you risk raising a question when you know your peers might be vulnerable to the fallacy of known intent? So what Annie and I propose is diversity training that helps students recognize these errors in reasoning so they can truly embrace those values of open inquiry and civil disagreement and examination of evidence. And we want to see classroom rules that reaffirm those values. I'm going to speak quickly on this next slide too. Right, these are an example of provocative questions that I never heard in grad school, right? Like Andrew Hartz, who presented on a panel yesterday, examines sociopolitical bias, says we could look at what's not being done. Things that aren't being done are asking provocative questions like this, or a whole host of other questions that, again, put you at risk of backlash and exclusion, and this is a really pernicious issue in the mental health field. It would put you at risk of ad hominem attacks or that fallacy of known intent. And I know this because I witnessed it. This is what happened in my grad school training. So we're going to go super quick on some of our recommendations. So the first one is just an assignment that we think, oh yeah.
Actually, yeah, the first one would be,
The HXA way.
how about the heterodox way, right? Like, there's no surprise here that we're going to sort of recommend training students in mental health and in all our disciplines in these skills, in open inquiry, in civil disagreement, in using evidence to create arguments, in having intellectual humility, which is what you need if you're going to have cultural humility, being charitable about other people's perspectives, and so that there is that openness. You can go ahead and describe. Oh, and obviously we want to resist that impulse to collapse people into essential identities, as we heard about also yesterday.
Yeah, we also want to help generate ideas for assignments that help provoke actual self-examination and really wrestle with those messier questions of social location, identity, and bias, because we really believe that the gold standard should be cultural humility, because we want clinicians to be aware of their biases, and we want them to be prepared to welcome in a diverse range of clients who are all worthy of care and meet them with that unconditional positive regard. And unfortunately, with modern diversity training, with the fallacies you see in it today, it's undermining a clinician's capacity to do that, and it's producing clinicians who are having difficulty stretching their perspective outside of their own certainty, and it prevents serious barriers to treatment that we believe is responsible, ethical, and just good care.
Yeah, we have a bunch of resources linked. There's a lot of great HXA people here working on this. The Mill Institute has a really great one-pager Viewpoint Diversity Challenge. This is a really lovely example of ground rules that are quite in contrast to the ones Grace had to deal with in her grad school. Should we go to
We'll open it
questions?
up for questions or comments.
For 3.5 minutes of questions,
For
okay.
3.5 minutes.
Questions? Yes.
I really appreciate this presentation so much. It's really chilling. I mean, those chats in particular, I mean, I think across academia and also among so many different professions, I've seen so many
Just
similar.
vitriol online
Yeah.
is a frightening phenomenon for sure.
One thing that I would suggest, I think it's more than certainty. I think that, you know, in terms of the track, that what I see is people, in many cases students, who, first of all, have a concept of identity that is entirely static. You know, you are what you
Reified,
or
yes,
you
for
believe
sure.
in, or what you espouse, or there's this sort of reification of adjectives in a way that's bizarre, and adjectives that should be transitory, right?
Absolutely.
You might think one thing, you might feel murderous rage in a particular moment. You know, you're not the sum of any particular emotion or idea that might pass through you. But so part of, I think, the problem is that a concept of identity that's very rigid and bizarre. But also, and then, like you pointed out, this wildly binary kind of thinking about identity and about the world, this very reductionist, there are the good and the bad, the oppressors and the oppressed, you know, and we all fall into one of two buckets. And then I also think that among many people, there's a concept of justice, of being good,
Yes.
which involves a kind of, I think at this point, I mean, some of what you put up there is a kind of ritualistic sadism. It's a sort of, we're gonna identify an enemy, we're gonna attack them, we're gonna humiliate them, cast them out,
Yeah.
to the extent possible, destroy them, socially, professionally,
Yeah.
et cetera. I mean, so there's something cray-cray happening.
And then I'm going to be your therapist right after I do that, right? It's
all of that,
terrifying.
Exactly. All of that in the name of justice.
Yeah.
All of that in the name of healing.
Yes.
So it's like we're
Yeah, the
fighting-
Inclusive Therapist
Yeah.
Board is that is part of what I find so chilling about that is they're so sure that they are espousing justice,
Yeah.
that
No,
this
but-
is justice, and it's
Exactly. But
scary.
But I think there's something in that also compulsion to pile on. I mean, part of it is the intimidation, and then combined with the adults in the room, like the people who are in positions of leadership, whether it's faculty or administrators, just shutting down, just backing out, refusing to hold their ground, refusing to, you know, just
Yeah.
be clear and direct.
Yep.
It's a perfect storm.
I agree.
I know you're short on time. This was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wondered, have you shared this with others, and how have you ever received
No, we're scared. We knew this was a safe space.
It's very good.
Thanks.
Have you received pushback for sharing something?
Only in our fantasies. My husband keeps saying, "Are you sure you're not going to get fired? Really can't. You can't get fired right now."
We'll hire.
Yeah, I've been keeping my cards kind of close to my chest. I'm so junior in my career too, so I think I'm going to keep, you know, flourishing, expanding. We'll
Yeah.
see where it
I
takes me.
think this will help. It feels good to have survived it. Well, from what I can tell so far, I think we've maybe survived. And so I certainly, yeah, I'm sort of, you know, people know I'm here and presenting from a university. Most of them have never heard of HXA, even though I've shared links, you know, for 3 years. But yeah, we'll see. Thanks for asking.
One more quick question.
One more quick question?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this to be thinking about what our theory of change is, right? Because this is something, this isn't just about what you guys are doing about this conference as a whole, because it is great to come here and have these conversations and stuff like that. But when we only talk about it to each other, you know,
Absolutely.
it doesn't get back to our disciplines. And I'm thinking about how to do this stuff in my discipline, which has some analogous issues in it. And one thing that I've just been doing is talking to people off the record. And when you talk with people off the record and you bring up these problems and questions that you're talking about, 80% of them are going to be like, yeah, that really is a problem. And once you've had like 20 of those conversations, you'll feel a lot more comfortable starting
That's
to
great.
speak publicly. So.
I really like that. I think that's great. I think, you know, I naively said to one of the presenters yesterday, who's Michael, what's his last, Strambler? I'm sorry, I can't remember, is that his name? He said that he had proposed to APA. I said to Andrew Hartz, oh, you should be presenting this stuff at APA. and American Psychological Association, and he said, would they accept it? And I'm thinking, yeah, why not? And then Michael said, oh, he had proposed to do with Daryl Wing Sue. You know, this is like godfather of diversity books, you know, in psychology. It's like, I read his stuff in grad school a long time ago. And he was going to have a conversation with him about the problem of race essentialism, which, you know, I think from Michael's perspective is he kind of contributed to that direction of things. And it got rejected by APA. I mean, and this guy's, he's a really big deal that, you know, well known. And so I felt a little disheartened by that. So, thank you so much. Hey, yeah, all right. Thank you so much.
So Max and I have written a scholarly article and a series of op-eds where we have been urging private universities to adopt First Amendment principles. And I want to just begin with a little bit of a sort of overview or kind of background on how we got to our current project. So a couple of years ago, Max and I wrote a paper analyzing whether universities had breached their contractual obligations to students when they moved to remote learning during COVID. And we were surprised when we worked on that project to see just how ambiguous the university-student relationship was, and consequently how much difficulty courts were having deciding whether universities had a contractual obligation to provide in-person learning. So courts ended up being split about whether there was a commitment to in-person learning, even across cases with similar fact patterns. So then, in the fall of 2023, as Max and I watched the congressional hearings with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn, we were again struck by how uncertain, in this case, the university presidents were or seemed to be about their own university policies when it came to student speech. The presidents seemed to waffle between claims that their universities adopted First Amendment principles and claims that they had student codes of conduct that prohibited hateful and offensive, though constitutionally protected, speech. Now, Congress members, for their part, were clearly outraged by the chaos on college campuses and by schools' inconsistent regulation of student speech, but they seemed unsure whether they wanted universities to commit to the First Amendment and protect speech broadly and consistently, or whether they wanted universities to enforce more substantive regulations on speech, more substantively restrictive speech codes. So private universities, it seemed to us, were at a crossroads. They could ramp up enforcement of speech codes and punish offensive speech, or they could, in effect, deregulate speech and commit to the First Amendment or to First Amendment principles. So, as I said at the outset, Max and I wrote this paper to urge universities to adopt the latter approach. And our argument is at core pragmatic, not philosophical. So we argue that given the realities of university organizational behavior, universities will only be able to satisfy their statutory and contractual obligations by committing to First Amendment principles. So just by way of overview, so I'm going to begin by talking about the statutory obligations that constrain how private universities regulate student speech. Max then is going to talk, a bit about the contractual promises that private universities make regarding student speech. And then we're both going to talk a bit about why it's so difficult for private universities to enforce speech codes in a way that satisfies their statutory and contractual obligations, and why a commitment to First Amendment principles mitigates or alleviates many of these problems. So private universities are not bound by the First Amendment, but they are bound by other statutes as well as their own contractual promises. So again, I'm going to begin by focusing on the statutory obligations. So universities that accept federal funds, which is almost all universities, are bound by the anti-discrimination provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as by Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. in any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Title VI has also been long interpreted as prohibiting discrimination targeting individuals because of their religion and ethnicity, and both the Trump and the Biden administrations have expressly interpreted Title VI as encompassing anti-Semitism. So Title VI requires schools to refrain from discriminating against students because of race, national origin, or ethnicity, and it requires schools to affirmatively punish and prevent harassment based on protected characteristics. Title IX operates similarly with regard to sex. So Title IX prohibits schools receiving federal funds from discriminating on the basis of sex in any educational program or activity. As with Title VI, Title IX requires universities to prevent discrimination based on sex and to affirmatively punish harassment. So while neither Title VI nor Title IX imposes direct obligations on universities regarding speech, the statutes require universities to enforce their own promises regarding student speech in a way that complies with the statute's anti-discrimination mandates. So universities may not punish speech in a way that differs based on the race, ethnicity, or sex of the speaker, listener, or group being discussed, and they must punish speech and conduct that constitutes harassment. So I'm going to turn things over now to Max to talk a little bit about contractual promises.
Right. And mainly what I'm going to do is focus on university handbooks, which most courts have interpreted as binding promises if sufficiently definite. And that's where most universities make their contractual commitments to students regarding speech and conduct and so forth. And they really run a gamut. We reviewed 25 elite schools' student handbooks. And you can have some schools like the University of Chicago and Washington University in St. Louis that actually make a commitment to the Chicago principles, or WashU explicitly says they follow the First Amendment standard regarding student speech. In other words, they will not punish speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. Then you have schools on the other end, which MIT and Northwestern fall into this category, where we cannot find any commitment to protecting student expression in the handbooks. So we have some hand waving at free expression in general, but there's really no promise. And in the middle, there's a big muddle, where it's actually really hard to figure out what on earth the schools are promising. And so to give you a case study of that, I'm going to use Penn, in part because, well, Penn was the focus of the hearings, and we can pick on Penn a little bit. So this is from the Penn book, which Pennsylvania courts would typically interpret as a contract. And it starts out on page 3 or 4, it's like 200 some pages long, regarding the rights of student citizenship. And you see 2B there, if you can read it, it says there's a right to freedom of thought and expression, okay? That is as of October 28th, 2023. Then on the next page, there's something on the responsibilities of student citizenship, where you can see that the university condemns hate speech, but the content of student speech or expression is not by itself a basis for disciplinary action, but student speech may be subject to discipline if it violates applicable laws or university regulations and policies, okay? So to me, I could drive a truck through that. They're walking back whatever speech commitment they've made by saying we have these policies in this 200-page book, you have to read them and understand them, okay? So then we see in, what happened? I'm sorry, this is not, they skipped one of my slides. So let me see if I can get this going again. Let me see this. Here we go. So this is actually 80 pages later. So if you flip through the handbook, 80 pages later, and I don't want you to read this, I just want to show you how much it is. You have guidelines on open expression. And none of these are that specific. Frankly, it's a lot of words, no examples are given. But this is what you get on page like 83, okay? Then you have October 7th. What happens after October 7th? After October 7th, Penn puts on its website a free speech FAQ, okay? In that free speech FAQ, they actually commit to a First Amendment standard, something that their handbook did not do, okay? So this is what it says, and I'll give you the highlights here. One of the FAQs is, what about hate speech? Well, hate speech is hard to define. It's protected under the First Amendment. We are not subject to the First Amendment, but we've embraced the First Amendment, okay? Nothing in Penn's handbook has actually embraced the First Amendment, but they have put an FAQ on their website saying that they have embraced the First Amendment. And this is what President Elizabeth McGill relied on in her sworn congressional testimony to say that Penn has committed to a First Amendment standard. It wasn't the handbook, it wasn't any prior publications, it was an FAQ posted on their webpage 3 weeks after October 7th. However, Claire Finkelstein, who is a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania and sits on their Academic Freedom Committee and an Open Expression Committee at the school, said in an op-ed shortly after this, Penn has never actually followed the First Amendment, not even to a close approximation. So you have a pretty good insider who actually sits on the disciplinary committees that enforces this handbook saying, we have never committed to it. I don't know what is going on at Penn. And she is an insider who should know. And that's when we say that there's issues with university organizational behavior. Well, there it is. Okay, so what happened to these FAQs? Go to the webpage now. I cached them, fortunately. They took them down in about February of 2024. So they no longer committed to, so here's my question to the room. What is Penn's policy regarding student expression? Has it committed to the First Amendment? Has it promisorially stopped itself from denying that it has a First Amendment commitment? That's a legal term, but maybe the president saying that there's a First Amendment commitment would allow students to rely on that. I think at the end of the day, we actually, we don't know what Penn's standard is. And what is a university disciplinary committee supposed to do under this ambiguity? How is a court reviewing a student expulsion or discipline under a Penn policy supposed to analyze what the contract is? Okay, I'll skip sort of the Northwestern issues and let Kim go back. So let me get this. Okay, go ahead.
So this kind of ambiguity, and Penn is not alone. As Max said, we reviewed a number of 25 university handbooks, and more of them were ambiguous. Far more of them were quite ambiguous than not. But this kind of ambiguity in student speech policies is no longer politically feasible. So schools need to clarify their positions on student speech, and they either must commit to some First Amendment principles, or they have to clarify their more restrictive speech codes and ensure that they are enforcing them in a way that complies with their anti-discrimination obligations under Title VI and under Title IX, as well as with whatever contractual obligations they may be creating through their own handbooks. So now I want to talk about why it's so difficult for universities to enforce more restrictive speech codes in a way that complies with their statutory and contractual obligations. So several factors, some endemic to the nature of speech codes and others a function of current university structure and politics, make the neutral and even-handed enforcement of university speech codes particularly difficult. So first, as Max's discussion of Penn's policy makes clear, university speech or civility codes tend to lack clarity. And again, Penn is not alone in this. We're not just picking on Penn. And this may not be merely, solely, entirely strategic behavior. It may not be strategic behavior at all. So unless schools simply provide a list of prescribed words, civility and speech codes will necessarily rely on some fairly broad standards and discretionary guidelines. But nonetheless, this lack of clarity makes consistent enforcement across cases difficult. Now, second, the campus adjudicative process is often opaque and lacking in procedural protections. And this procedural informality provides fertile ground for decision-maker bias and more inconsistent outcomes based on participants' group identities. Relatedly, decisions on violations and punishments don't require adherence to precedent, which often is not even known within universities. So adjudicative bodies also change composition over time, and standards are sometimes rewritten to account for changing norms. Finally, the composition of the bodies conducting the disciplinary reviews and issuing judgments tend to be a mix of administrators, faculty, and students with, as we've heard a lot about throughout this conference already, ideologically homogeneous viewpoints. So now I'm going to turn things over to Max to talk about why when schools commit to First Amendment principles, a number of these problems are mitigated.
So why do we think a First Amendment commitment, and I mean a contractual commitment, can fix some of these problems? This is not, or at least address some of these problems. This is not an unusual thing you see in contract law. If there's a hard standard to specify in the contract, you actually make an external reference to a standard like an industry standard that has been created by industry and can be updated from time to time and might have a lot of underlying documentation behind it. And so we think that a First Amendment commitment in the first instance will import by reference a whole body of case law, 100 years of case law or more, dealing with the scope of protected speech. And this is something that a university really can't develop so much on its own. The commitment to the First Amendment would also shrink the class of cases that could plausibly be subject to sanction, and thereby providing fewer opportunities for basically any administrative review in the first place. In fact, we would recommend that in-house counsel would have to pass, or somebody in in-house counsel, university counsel, would have to pass on any student or other complaint based solely on speech before it could go to any disciplinary review process. So we would really introduce a summary judgment type approach to any student complaint. A clear First Amendment commitment also increases the possibility of judicial oversight. So something we saw in the COVID cases and something you could see and have seen actually in the speech cases is a judge looking at the mess of what the university has promised. It's not all in the same place. There's all these cross-references. We don't really know what the commitment is. It's shifted over time. They might just say, you know, this isn't even a contract. There's no promises made. I'm not going to deal with. Whereas another judge could look at this and say, you know, something was promised to students. I'm going to work hard to actually figure out what it is. So there's a lot of legal uncertainty in the current situation if you have an ambiguous handbook. If you adopt the First Amendment, judges have to review First Amendment cases all the time. They can't dodge the issue. They would have to say, okay, so the university has adopted the First Amendment by reference. That's a clear contractual promise. I am expert as a judge in understanding what the First Amendment, scope of the First Amendment is, and so I can actually take this case and pass on it. That's assuming a student or a faculty member winds up appealing. So it creates a possibility for a neutral body to review these issues. And the second or last thing commitment to the First Amendment would do is we think it might actually avoid students using the campus adjudicative system to settle personal disputes and actually introduce the university as an arbitrator on contentious social issues, which is often what students are looking for. And in fact, the Harvard report on anti-Semitism actually specifically referenced this issue, is that students expect universities to be adjudicators now. If you adopt the First Amendment standard, you would take yourself out of that role. You have to deal with it on your own, unless there's something like a true threat or something else that takes the speech outside of First Amendment protection. And then purely as a casual empirical matter, and I think we'll end with this and open for questions, purely as a casual empirical matter, public universities have to abide by the First Amendment, and that has been law since 1973 or 72. I forget the first case that clearly stated that. And public universities have not done worse, at least in my observation, in the latest round of campus chaos than private schools that have actually fairly rigorous speech codes. And if you look at the FIRE rankings, and I know we can debate them or what have you, but the top 50 are overwhelmingly public schools. The bottom 50 are largely private schools. It does seem like public schools do actually follow, by and large, their First Amendment commitments, and it has not led to chaos on campus. In fact, we suspect rather the opposite. But even beyond that, that's sort of a normative take we have. But our positive point, if we're really speaking to university council, is you could solve a lot of your issues by committing to a clear legal standard, and one's right there for you, the First Amendment to the Constitution. And with that, we'll take whatever time we have left for questions. Please.
Yeah, well, you're doing really important work. I had a few questions. One is a footnote on the panel on this, and when I through the FIRE and various websites, I mean the Amy Wax case came up in the last 5 years, and she's been subjected to kind of persecution and with very draconian penalties and so on. And the problem, so my question is, could you extend the sort of strategy for expanding First Amendment logic to undergraduates? Could you extend that to faculty and use the same language that refers you to the First Amendment in both the contracts, signing, hiring contracts of the faculty member, and the handbook sort of advice to the
Yeah, thanks for that question.
So just to summarize it quickly for the room, the question is, could we extend our project basically to faculty speech as well, with specific reference to the Amy Wax case?
Yeah, and that's actually the project that we're working on now, is that we're actually focusing on faculty handbooks and their commitments to academic freedom and the extent to which, the scope to which academic freedom is encompassing First Amendment principles. Academic freedom is viewed as a First Amendment right legally to some degree, but they're not completely coterminous. That is, academic freedom in some cases gets you more protection, in some cases gets you less protection than traditional First Amendment principles. I'll let you add.
Have you read Keith Whittington's latest book?
We have not, but it's on our list.
That's
But-
what's reading, especially chapter 4 and 5.
If I could just put an asterisk on the Amy Wax case, the Penn faculty handbook's language is almost identical to the Penn undergraduate handbook language. So they're punishing, however you view the punishment of Amy Wax, it's being done under almost identical language to the student handbook. The other thing that's interesting is Siegel Ben-Porath, who actually authored the FAQs, sat on the committee reviewing Amy Wax's conduct and speech. And so that just shows you how malleable the standard actually can be. So I appreciate it. Please.
Yeah, hi. So I wonder if you can clarify something for me, and I hear conflicting views about this, but is Title VI actually consistent with the First Amendment? So speech that constitutes discrimination or harassment under Title VI would actually be protected speech under the First Amendment. Is that true or not? I hear both sides.
So this is a really good question, because I think this has been kind of a confusing issue over the last couple of years as there's been this question about speech that is discriminatory. Do schools need to punish it, and then are they getting into problems with the First Amendment? So as sort of a matter of sort of pure legal theory, what is actionable under Title VI should be non-overlapping with what is protected under the First Amendment. So speech that is First Amendment protected is not considered sort of definitionally by these legal categories to be actionable harassment. And if it is actionable harassment, it is not First Amendment protected.
Can you explain what you mean by actionable harassment?
Yeah, so Title VI and Title IX both require schools, just like Title VII requires employers, to punish speech that rises to the level of harassment. And there has been an ongoing sort of discussion in the law school community as to whether the whole doctrine of harassment actually violates the First Amendment. That is, whether requiring employers, whether requiring universities to punish particular speech is a violation of the First Amendment. The courts, I don't think, frankly, they've done great analysis of this, but to the extent we've got sort of judicial analysis of this, what they say is speech that rises to the level of harassment under Title VI, Title IX, Title VII, more of the cases, frankly, have been under Title VII, is not First Amendment protected speech. So under the First Amendment, so there's been a lot of sort of talk about this over the last few years, the First Amendment doesn't protect all speech, right? There are carve-outs. And so one of the carve-outs of the kind of speech that is not protected under the First Amendment is harassment. So that's what I mean by these are non-overlapping categories.
So it sounds, but I would think that there has to be a hierarchy. So first of all, you have to allow everything that's not disallowed by the First Amendment. And so you cannot bring a Title VI that it has additional carve-outs, because that completely modifies the First Amendment.
Yes. So under Title VI, public schools cannot be, in theory, they cannot be disciplined for allowing speech that does not rise to the level of harassment. And that was one of the challenges in the congressional hearings, because the presidents were basically saying, they were getting asked, is this statement okay? Is this permissible? And they were struggling because they were saying, sort of rightly so, it depends on context as to whether that speech is unprotected under the First Amendment. So only if it's unprotected under the First Amendment can schools be required to penalize it under Title VI, and themselves penalized by the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, if they don't respond to that speech.
I think we're out of time, but Kim and I will stay around and talk to anyone else who wants. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll stick around if you have more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.